A routine visit gone wrong. The elegant downtown district buzzed with life as people strolled along wide cobblestone paths lined with boutique storefronts. Among them, Madison Square's crown jewel stood tall, Prestige Emporium, a luxury department store boasting grandeur. Its gold-accented glass doors invited patrons to step into a world of extravagance. Inside, soft classical music played while the scent of fresh lilies wafted through the air. Sales associates, dressed in tailored uniforms, glided through the aisles, offering curated advice to the wealthy clientele browsing high-end merchandise. Among these patrons were Danielle and Trevor Johnson, a black couple dressed impeccably for their Saturday outing. Danielle wore a soft lavender blouse paired with a crisp white blazer and matching trousers. Her natural curls framed her face elegantly as her almond eyes lit up at the sight of a delicate pearl necklace displayed in one of the cases. Trevor, on the other hand, exuded confidence in a tailored navy suit, his polished leather shoes clicking softly against the marble floor as he moved to admire an array of designer watches. The couple whispered quietly, sharing their thoughts and occasional laughs as they meandered through the store. For Danielle, it was a much-anticipated treat to celebrate her recent promotion to vice president at a prominent marketing firm. For Trevor, it was a chance to make his wife feel cherished. However, not everyone appreciated their presence. At the far end of the store, Neil Carter, a newly hired security guard, leaned against the wall, his arms crossed tightly across his broad chest. He'd only been working at Prestige Emporium for 2 weeks, but he'd already decided it was the kind of place that required vigilance, especially when it came to people who, in his eyes, didn't fit in. Neil was an imposing man in his late 30s, his towering frame accentuated by his neatly pressed uniform and polished boots. His sharp, blue eyes scanned the store like a hawk. While most patrons moved under his radar, Danielle and Trevor caught his attention immediately. Neil narrowed his eyes, taking in the couple's cheerful demeanor and ease as they inspected items many wouldn't dare to touch without assistance. To Neil, they seemed too comfortable. Probably here to cause trouble, he muttered under his breath. As Danielle reached for a necklace's price tag, Neil sprang into action, marching toward the couple with a purposeful stride. His heavy boots echoed ominously across the floor. Danielle noticed him first, her brow furrowing as she caught sight of his stern expression. Trevor turned moments later, instinctively stepping closer to his wife. "Excuse me," Neil said sharply, his voice louder than necessary. Heads turned in the surrounding aisles. Danielle blinked in surprise. "Yes. Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice calm yet firm. "This area is reserved for serious customers," Neil replied, his tone clipped and condescending. "If you're not planning on buying anything, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Trevor's friendly smile faded. "We are serious customers," he said evenly. "What makes you think otherwise?" Neil crossed his arms, smirking. "People have been watching you too. You're making them uncomfortable. I suggest you leave before it becomes an issue." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Danielle inhaled deeply, willing herself to remain composed. She knew better than to let her frustration show. "We haven't done anything wrong," she said, her voice steady. "We're just browsing like everyone else." "Look," Neil interrupted, "I don't want trouble, but this isn't the kind of place you just browse. Either make a purchase or move along." Trevor's jaw tightened. "Are you serious right now?" Neil took a step closer, his hand hovering near his walkie-talkie. "I don't like repeating myself," he said flatly. Around them, murmurs rippled through the store. Other shoppers paused to watch, their gazes ranging from curious to judgmental. Danielle felt her cheeks burn, not from shame but from the blatant humiliation Neil was subjecting them to. Trevor placed a calming hand on her back, silently encouraging her to walk away. Reluctantly, she nodded. Without another word, the couple turned and walked toward the exit. Their heads were held high, their movements deliberate, but the sting of the encounter lingered in the air. As they exited, Neil straightened his badge with a self-satisfied grin. "Just doing my job," he muttered, glancing at a nearby coworker who avoided his gaze. Out in the parking lot, Danielle and Trevor sat in their sleek black sedan, the tension between them palpable. Danielle stared out the window, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Trevor, ever the optimist, tried to find the words to lighten the mood, but even he struggled to shake off the indignity they'd just faced. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, placing a hand on her arm. Danielle turned to him, her eyes sharp. "Am I okay?" she repeated. "Trevor, that man treated us like criminals, in front of everyone. How am I supposed to be okay?" Trevor sighed. "I know, sweetheart. It was awful. But what can we do? People like him don't change." Danielle reached for her phone. "We might not change him," she said, her voice resolute, "but we can make sure no one else has to deal with what we just did." Trevor frowned. "What are you doing?" "Calling Caroline Hastings," Danielle replied, her fingers flying across her phone screen. Trevor blinked in surprise. "Caroline, as in the regional director of this entire store chain?" "Exactly." Danielle's lips curved into a determined smile. "She's not just a friend, Trevor. She's an ally. And if anyone can do something about this, it's her." Trevor leaned back in his seat, his frustration giving way to admiration. Neil has no idea who he just messed with. Moments later, Danielle's phone buzzed with a reply. Caroline's message was brief but clear. "Meet me at the flagship store tonight. Bring Trevor. We need to talk." Danielle turned to her husband. "Let's go." Trevor nodded, starting the engine. This should be interesting. As they drove off, neither could have anticipated how quickly the situation would escalate, or the unexpected consequences awaiting Neil back at Prestige Emporium. The tipping point. Back at Prestige Emporium, Neil Carter leaned against the security desk, his chest puffed with a sense of accomplishment. To him, it had been a routine encounter, a necessary measure to maintain the store's exclusivity. He scanned the store lazily, his earlier tension easing as the couple he'd deemed a problem was now gone. His coworker, Lisa Nguyen, approached hesitantly. Lisa was petite, with sharp features softened by her gentle demeanor. She'd been at the store for 3 years, long enough to see Neil's type come and go, confident, overzealous, and quick to pass judgment. She wrung her hands nervously as she stopped beside him. "Neil," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't bother looking at her. "Yeah. That couple you just asked to leave. Are you sure that was necessary?" she asked, glancing around to ensure no one else was listening. They didn't seem like they were doing anything wrong. Neil scoffed, finally turning to face her. "Lisa, trust me. I know the type. People like them don't come here to shop. They come to disrupt, to draw attention to themselves, or worse." Lisa's frown deepened. "What do you mean, people like them?" "You know what I mean," Neil replied, lowering his voice but not softening his tone. "Look, this is a luxury store. It's not for everyone. My job is to protect the atmosphere, make sure the real customers feel comfortable." Lisa stared at him in disbelief. "Neil, they were dressed better than half the people in here. And they weren't disrupting anything. They were just browsing like anyone else." "Exactly," Neil said, nodding as if she'd proven his point. "They were too comfortable. It didn't sit right with me." Lisa opened her mouth to argue, but the arrival of the store manager, Robert Mason, silenced her. Robert was a tall, stern man in his mid-40s, with a no-nonsense attitude and a reputation for being meticulous. His sharp gray suit and polished demeanor gave him an air of authority that Neil secretly admired. "Neil," Robert said briskly, his eyes narrowing slightly. "A word in my office." Neil straightened, his chest tightening. "Is something wrong?" Robert didn't answer, simply turning on his heel and striding toward the back office. Neil glanced at Lisa, who gave him a look of apprehension but said nothing. With a sigh, Neil followed Robert, his confidence faltering slightly. Inside the office, Robert shut the door firmly before crossing his arms. "We have a problem." he began, his tone clipped. Neil furrowed his brow, trying to maintain his composure. What kind of problem? Robert leaned against the desk, his gaze sharp. A customer complaint just came through about the couple you escorted out. Do you know who they are? Neil shrugged, feigning indifference. No idea. Just a couple of people who didn't belong here. Robert's jaw tightened. That couple happens to be Danielle and Trevor Johnson. Danielle is a vice president at one of the top marketing firms in the city, and Trevor is an investment banker. They could probably buy out half this store if they wanted to. Neil's face reddened, but he quickly shook his head. I was just doing my job, sir. They were acting suspiciously. They were browsing. Robert interrupted sharply, his voice rising. And you decided, based on nothing but your own bias, that they didn't belong here. Do you realize how this looks? How it reflects on the store? Before Neil could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. Robert sighed, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. Come in. The door opened to reveal Caroline Hastings, the regional director of Prestige Emporium. Caroline was a commanding presence, her sharp navy blazer and perfectly styled hair accentuating the authority she carried effortlessly. Her expression was calm but unreadable as she stepped into the room. Robert, she said, nodding briefly before turning her piercing gaze to Neil. I need a word with your security guard. Neil's stomach churned. He'd heard of Caroline. Everyone at Prestige Emporium knew her name, but he'd never imagined he'd be face to face with her, and certainly not under these circumstances. Of course, Robert said, stepping aside. I'll let you handle this. As Robert left the room, Caroline closed the door behind him and folded her arms. You must be Neil Carter, she said, her tone cool. Yes, ma'am, Neil replied, standing straighter. I was just. Save it, Caroline interrupted, holding up a hand. I've already been briefed on what happened tonight. I need to hear your side of the story. Neil hesitated, swallowing hard. I was just doing my job, Mom, he began. The couple seemed out of place, and I didn't want to risk any disruptions. Out of place, Caroline repeated, her voice laced with incredulity. Explain what you mean by that. Neil stumbled over his words. Well, they weren't acting like, typical customers. Caroline's eyes narrowed. And what exactly does a typical customer look like, Mr. Carter? Neil's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Caroline stepped closer, her gaze icy. Let me make this clear. Prestige Emporium does not discriminate. Your assumptions and actions tonight have jeopardized the reputation of this store and the values we stand for. I've reviewed the surveillance footage, and I see no justification for your behavior. She placed a tablet on the desk, tapping the screen to display the footage. Neil watched as the video showed Danielle and Trevor browsing calmly, their demeanor far from the suspicious behavior he described. The only disruption came when Neil himself approached them, his body language aggressive. Is this how you define professionalism? Caroline asked, her voice razor-sharp. Neil's confidence crumbled completely. Ma'am, I didn't mean any harm, he stammered. I was just trying to protect the store. Caroline's lips pressed into a thin line. Protect the store from what exactly? Paying customers who were doing nothing wrong. I made a mistake, Neil admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Caroline straightened, her expression unreadable once more. Unfortunately, this isn't just about one mistake. We've received other complaints about how you've treated certain customers. Tonight's incident was the tipping point. Neil's stomach dropped. Are you firing me? Caroline's gaze hardened. Consider this a suspension while we conduct a formal review. Effective immediately, you are to leave the premises. I'll be informing corporate of this incident. Neil nodded numbly, the weight of her words sinking in. As Caroline turned to leave, her phone buzzed with a message. She glanced at the screen, her expression softening slightly. Danielle and Trevor Johnson are on their way to the flagship store, she said. I'll be meeting them personally to ensure this matter is resolved. Meanwhile, I suggest you reflect on your actions. Mr. Carter." With that, she exited the office, leaving Neil alone with his thoughts and the crushing realization of what he just lost. A meeting that changes everything. Danielle and Trevor Johnson arrived at the flagship store of Prestige Emporium just as the evening sky darkened, painting the cityscape with hues of deep blue and golden lights. The store was even grander than the one they had just left, with an entrance framed by towering marble pillars and illuminated by an elaborate chandelier visible through the glass facade. Danielle adjusted her blazer as they exited their car, her expression calm but determined. Trevor reached for her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You sure you want to go through with this?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Danielle glanced at him, her eyes sharp. "Absolutely. This isn't just about us, Trevor. This is about what we stand for. If we don't speak up, nothing changes." Trevor nodded, his admiration for his wife growing even stronger. Together, they stepped through the revolving doors, entering a world of opulence. Inside, they were greeted by Caroline Hastings herself. The regional director stood near the entrance, her poised demeanor and warm smile a stark contrast to the tension still lingering from earlier that evening. She extended her hand to Danielle first, then to Trevor. "Danielle, Trevor," Caroline said, her voice smooth but tinged with seriousness. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. I wanted to address this situation personally." Danielle nodded. "Thank you for reaching out so quickly, Caroline. This isn't something we could ignore." Caroline motioned toward a private lounge area, just off the main showroom floor. "Let's talk privately," she said, leading them past rows of sleek displays and impeccably dressed customers. The lounge was a quiet, luxurious space with plush seating and soft lighting. As they settled into the leather armchairs, Caroline folded her hands in her lap and leaned forward slightly. "I've been briefed on what happened," she began, "and I've already taken initial steps to address the matter. Neil Carter has been suspended pending a formal review, and I've escalated the incident to corporate. But I wanted to hear directly from you both. Tell me, in your own words, what happened tonight." Danielle took a deep breath before speaking, recounting the encounter with precision and clarity. She detailed how Neil had approached them, how his tone had grown increasingly condescending, and how they had been made to feel unwelcome despite doing nothing wrong. Trevor chimed in occasionally, his voice steady but edged with frustration. Caroline listened intently, her expression a mix of empathy and concern. When Danielle finished, there was a brief silence before Caroline spoke. "First, let me apologize on behalf of Prestige Emporium," she said, her voice firm. "What you experienced is unacceptable. This store and this company are supposed to represent inclusivity and respect for all customers. Neil's actions were in direct violation of those values." Danielle tilted her head slightly, studying Caroline. "I appreciate your apology, Caroline, but an apology isn't enough. How do we ensure this doesn't happen again? Not just to us, but to anyone?" Caroline nodded, her respect for Danielle evident. "You're absolutely right. An apology is just the beginning. We're taking immediate steps to implement mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all employees, starting with security staff. Additionally, I'm personally overseeing a review of our hiring and training practices to ensure this kind of behavior is not just discouraged but eradicated." Trevor leaned forward, his tone measured. "That's a start, Caroline. But training isn't enough if the culture doesn't change. It's easy to sit through a seminar and check a box. What happens when the seminar ends? How do you hold people accountable?" Caroline's lips pressed into a thin line as she considered his words. "You're right again. Accountability is key. That's why we're introducing a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior, with immediate consequences for violations. And to ensure this policy is enforced, we're establishing an anonymous reporting system so employees and customers alike can voice concerns without fear of retaliation." Danielle exchanged a glance with Trevor, her expression softening slightly. "That's a step in the right direction," she said. "But we'll be watching closely. This isn't just about policy. It's about changing the perception of what places like this represent. People need to know they're welcome here, regardless of who they are or what they look like." Caroline smiled faintly, a hint of admiration in her eyes. "You have my word, Danielle. I'll make sure this becomes more than just a promise." As they continued discussing the details of the planned changes, the conversation shifted to broader topics. Danielle and Trevor shared their own experiences as successful Black professionals navigating spaces that weren't always welcoming. Caroline listened intently, her own understanding of the challenges they faced deepening with each story. By the time the meeting concluded, the tension that had accompanied Danielle and Trevor into the store had eased. As they stood to leave, Caroline extended her hand again. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention," she said sincerely. "Your courage in speaking up is what will drive change, not just here, but in the industry as a whole." Danielle shook her hand firmly. "We just want to see progress, Caroline. Real progress." Trevor nodded in agreement. "We'll be watching." As they left the flagship store, the couple felt a sense of vindication, though the journey was far from over. What they didn't know was that their actions were already creating ripples far beyond Prestige Emporium. Meanwhile, back at the original store, Neil sat alone in the break room, his hands clasped tightly as he stared at the floor. The reality of his suspension weighed heavily on him. He had spent years cultivating his image as a vigilant security guard, but now, that very attitude had cost him everything. His phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence. He glanced at the screen to see a message from a coworker. "Caroline Hastings is here. She's meeting with corporate tomorrow morning. Heard she's not happy." Neil swallowed hard, the full gravity of his situation sinking in. This wasn't just a suspension. It could be the end of his career. And for the first time, he began to question whether his actions, fueled by assumptions and biases, had been worth the cost. Little did he know, the fallout from his behavior was just beginning. The ripple effect. The morning light streamed through the towering windows of the Prestige Emporium corporate headquarters, a gleaming glass structure nestled in the heart of the city. Inside, the tension was palpable as the company's leadership team gathered in a sleek, high-tech conference room. At the head of the table sat Caroline Hastings, her navy blazer crisp and her demeanor calm but resolute. Across from her sat the store's CEO, Margaret Sinclair, a poised woman in her early 50s with silver-streaked hair and a reputation for decisive leadership. Around them, a group of regional managers and corporate advisors exchanged uneasy glances. The incident involving Neil Carter had escalated quickly, drawing not only internal scrutiny, but also whispers from influential voices in the city's business and media circles. Caroline had made it clear that this was not a meeting to brush things under the rug. It was a call to action. Margaret began the meeting with her trademark directness. "Caroline, you've outlined the basics of the situation in your report, but I want to hear it in detail. What happened, and what are we doing about it?" Caroline nodded, her expression unwavering. "The incident occurred last night at the Madison Square store. Neil Carter, a newly hired security guard, made the decision to remove Danielle and Trevor Johnson from the premises based on what he described as suspicious behavior. Surveillance footage and eyewitness accounts confirmed that the couple was doing nothing more than browsing, like any other customer." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. "Danielle Johnson, isn't she the VP at Albright Marketing?" "She is," Caroline confirmed. "And her husband, Trevor, is an investment banker at Harbor Capital." A murmur rippled through the room. The weight of those names was not lost on anyone present. These were not just disgruntled customers. They were influential professionals whose voices carried significant weight in the community. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled. "Go on." Caroline continued. "After being humiliated and removed from the store, Danielle reached out to me directly. I met with them at the flagship store last night, where they shared their experience and made it clear that they were not only seeking accountability, but also systemic change." "And what steps have we taken so far?" Margaret asked. I suspended Neil Carter immediately and initiated a formal review of his conduct, Caroline said. Additionally, I proposed mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all staff, a review of our hiring practices, and the implementation of an anonymous reporting system for incidents of discrimination. One of the regional managers, a man named Henry, raised his hand tentatively. Caroline, these are all important steps, but we need to consider the broader implications. This story could leak to the press. How do we control the narrative? Caroline's gaze sharpened. The best way to control the narrative is to ensure that our actions speak louder than any potential headline. If we focus on genuine accountability and systemic change, there won't be a narrative to control. There will be a story of a company that owned its mistakes and worked to correct them. Margaret nodded approvingly. I agree, but we need to act quickly. Have you spoken with Danielle and Trevor since last night? I've kept them updated on our initial steps, Caroline replied. They've made it clear that they're watching closely to see how we follow through. And frankly, I don't blame them. Margaret tapped her pen thoughtfully against the table. Caroline, I want you to lead this initiative personally. Work with HR to roll out the training programs, and I want a full report on Neil Carter's review by the end of the week. Henry, coordinate with PR to prepare a statement in case this story gains traction. Yes, Mom, Henry replied. Margaret stood, signaling the end of the meeting. Let's not waste time. This is not just about protecting our brand. It's about living up to the values we claim to represent. As the meeting dispersed, Caroline remained seated, scrolling through her notes. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to ensure that this incident became a turning point, not just for Prestige Emporium, but for the broader industry. Meanwhile, at the Johnsons' home, Danielle sat at the kitchen island, her laptop open, and a steaming cup of coffee beside her. She was composing an email to Caroline, outlining additional recommendations for addressing systemic bias within the company. Trevor entered the room, carrying a plate of toast. Still working on that email? He asked, setting the plate down beside her. Danielle nodded, her fingers flying across the keyboard. If we're going to hold them accountable, we need to give them clear expectations. This isn't just about what happened to us. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Trevor took a sip of his coffee, studying his wife with a mix of admiration and concern. You're incredible, you know that. Danielle glanced up, a faint smile playing at her lips. I just want to make a difference, Trevor. If we don't push for change, who will? Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a notification ping. Danielle clicked over to her inbox and saw a message from Caroline. She opened it quickly, scanning the contents. She wants to meet with us again, Danielle said, her brow furrowing slightly. At the Madison Square store. Trevor raised an eyebrow. The same store where all this happened. Danielle nodded. She says she wants us to see the changes they're putting in place firsthand. Trevor leaned back in his chair, considering. What do you think? I think we should go, Danielle said firmly. If they're serious about change, we need to be there to hold them to it. At the Madison Square store, the atmosphere was markedly different from the night before. Neil Carter was nowhere to be seen, and the remaining staff moved with a palpable sense of urgency. Listen, Nguyen, the co-worker who had questioned Neil's actions, watched as corporate representatives arrived to install new training materials and signage emphasizing the store's commitment to diversity and inclusion. Lisa felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had always prided herself on treating every customer with respect, but Neil's actions had made her question whether she could have done more to intervene. Now, with the weight of corporate scrutiny bearing down on the store, she was determined to be part of the solution. As Danielle and Trevor arrived later that afternoon, they were greeted warmly by Caroline and the store manager, Robert. The couple noticed subtle but significant changes. More diverse imagery in the store's advertising, staff wearing badges with pronouns and languages they spoke, and a sign at the entrance that read, "Welcome to all." We've started rolling out some of the changes we discussed. Caroline said as she led them through the store. "There's still a lot of work to do, but I hope you'll see that we're committed to making things right." Danielle nodded, her gaze sweeping the store. "It's a good start," she said. "But it's just that, a start." Trevor added, "The real test will be whether this is still happening 6 months from now, a year from now." Caroline smiled faintly. "You're right. Change takes time, but we're in it for the long haul, and I hope you'll hold us accountable every step of the way." As the tour concluded, Danielle and Trevor left the store with cautious optimism. While the wounds of the previous night hadn't healed completely, they felt a sense of hope that their voices had sparked something meaningful. What they didn't know was that Neil Carter, now sitting in a mandatory HR session, was beginning to confront the biases that had shaped his actions and the consequences they had wrought. His journey toward understanding and accountability was just beginning. Accountability and transformation. Neil Carter sat in a drab conference room at Prestige Emporium's corporate office, a small screen flickering before him. The mandatory training session had begun with a series of sobering statistics about bias in the retail industry. Neil shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his arms crossed, and his jaw tight. He had never considered himself biased, at least, not until now. The facilitator, a calm yet authoritative woman named Dr. Rachel Monroe, stood at the front of the room. She was a renowned diversity and inclusion consultant who had been brought in to address the fallout from the incident. Her eyes scanned the room, lingering on Neil for a moment before she spoke. "Today we're going to have some uncomfortable conversations," she began, her voice steady. "But discomfort is where growth happens. We're not here to point fingers. We're here to examine how our biases, conscious or unconscious, shape the decisions we make every day." Neil scoffed under his breath, earning a glance from a colleague seated nearby. He had agreed to attend the session only because it was a condition of his suspension being reviewed. Yet, as Rachel continued, something in her tone made him listen. She clicked to a slide showing a series of images, people of different races, ages, and socioeconomic backgrounds shopping in a variety of settings. "When you see these individuals," Rachel asked, "what assumptions do you make? Who do you think belongs in a luxury store like Prestige Emporium? Who might you consider out of place?" The room was silent. Neil stared at the images, his earlier confidence faltering. The exercise hit uncomfortably close to home. Rachel then displayed footage from Neil's own interaction with Danielle and Trevor. Gasps rippled through the room as the others watched Neil's demeanor and tone toward the couple. "Let's break this down," Rachel said, pausing the video. "Mr. Carter, can you explain your thought process here?" Neil cleared his throat, suddenly aware of all eyes on him. I thought they were acting suspiciously," he said hesitantly. "They weren't really looking like typical customers." Rachel tilted her head. "What does a typical customer look like?" Neil fumbled for an answer but found none. Rachel's silence forced him to confront the question in a way he never had before. He had assumed things about Danielle and Trevor, not based on their actions, but on their appearance. After a long pause, Neil finally muttered, "I guess I made a mistake." Rachel nodded, her expression neutral. "Mistakes are part of being human. The question is, what do we do when we realize we've made one?" The session continued, delving into topics Neil had never considered before: implicit bias, systemic racism, and the long history of exclusion in spaces like luxury retail. For the first time, Neil found himself questioning not just his actions, but the beliefs and assumptions that had led to them. As the session ended, Rachel approached Neil personally. "Mr. Carter," she said, her tone gentle but firm, "it takes courage to face your mistakes. The fact that you stayed engaged today shows you're willing to learn. The next step is applying what you've learned." Neil nodded, feeling a mix of shame and determination. "Thank you," he said quietly. While Neil wrestled with his own transformation, Danielle and Trevor Johnson were making waves of their own. News of the incident had spread beyond corporate walls, catching the attention of local media and sparking discussions on social media. Danielle, ever the strategist, had used her marketing expertise to frame the narrative carefully. In an op-ed for a prominent publication, she wrote about the experience, not with bitterness, but with hope for change. Titled "The Luxury of Inclusion," a call for change in retail spaces, the piece resonated widely, garnering praise for its balanced tone and actionable suggestions. "We don't share our story to shame," Danielle wrote, "but to shine a light on the everyday experiences of those who are judged before they even speak. Change begins with awareness, but it requires commitment and action to take root." The article quickly went viral, leading to interviews and panel discussions where Danielle and Trevor spoke about the importance of equity in all spaces, not just retail. They became unlikely advocates for a cause they had never anticipated championing, but they embraced the role wholeheartedly. At Prestige Emporium, the ripple effects of their advocacy were tangible. Caroline Hastings worked tirelessly to ensure the changes she had promised were being implemented. Diversity training sessions became standard for all employees, and new hiring practices were put in place to ensure a more inclusive workforce. The company also launched a customer advisory board, inviting individuals from diverse backgrounds to provide feedback on their experiences. Caroline, however, knew the work was far from over. One evening, as she reviewed reports in her office, her assistant knocked gently on the door. "Caroline," the assistant said, "Danielle and Trevor Johnson are here to see you." Caroline smiled. "Send them in." The couple entered, their presence as commanding as ever. Danielle wore a vibrant teal dress, while Trevor's tailored suit complemented her perfectly. They exchanged pleasantries before taking their seats. "I wanted to show you something," Caroline said, sliding a folder across the desk. "This is the progress we've made since our last meeting." Danielle opened the folder, her eyes scanning the documents. There were detailed reports on the training sessions, feedback from employees, and even early data showing improved customer satisfaction scores. Trevor leaned in, nodding approvingly. "This is impressive," Danielle admitted. "You've made a lot of progress." Caroline smiled faintly. "It's a start, but I want you to know that we're not stopping here. This is an ongoing commitment." Danielle closed the folder and looked Caroline in the eye. "Good, because this isn't just about one store or one company. It's about changing the way people think." Trevor added, "And you've got our support, for as long as you stay true to your word." Caroline extended her hand, sealing their partnership with a firm handshake. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "Your voices have been instrumental in making this happen." Back at his apartment, Neil Carter sat alone, reflecting on the past few weeks. His suspension had been extended indefinitely, and he knew his career at Prestige Emporium was likely over. Yet, for the first time, he felt a glimmer of clarity. He pulled out his laptop and began drafting an email to Danielle and Trevor Johnson. It was an apology, raw and unpolished, but heartfelt. He didn't expect a reply, nor did he feel he deserved one. But writing it was a step, a small act of accountability in the long journey ahead. As he hit send, Neil felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He couldn't undo the harm he had caused, but he could commit to being better. And for now, that was enough. Accountability and transformation. Neil leaned back in his chair after sending the email, his thoughts swirling. His apartment, once a place of pride, now felt hollow, a reflection of his uncertain future. The mandatory training sessions had forced him to confront parts of himself he had never examined, and while he felt raw and exposed, he also felt something else: determination. As the days passed, Neil found himself reflecting more deeply on his past actions, not just at Prestige Emporium, but throughout his life. He realized that his assumptions and biases had shaped his interactions with people long before he became a security guard. He decided that if he wanted to move forward, he needed to understand where those biases came from and how to dismantle them. Neil began researching on his own, reading articles and watching videos about systemic racism, unconscious bias, and the experiences of marginalized communities in spaces like retail. He found himself drawn to stories of resilience and change, stories of people who had overcome their own prejudices to become advocates for inclusion. One evening, while scrolling through an article on inclusivity, Neil noticed a community event being advertised, Breaking Barriers, a discussion on bias and belonging. The event was open to the public and featured a panel of speakers, including Danielle Johnson. Neil hesitated, his finger hovering over the RSVP button. Would he even be welcome there? After a moment, he clicked it, deciding that he had nothing to lose. The event was held in a community center, its walls adorned with art from local creators celebrating diversity. Neil arrived early, his nerves on edge. He recognized Danielle immediately when she walked in with Trevor. The couple moved gracefully through the crowd, stopping to greet attendees and answer questions. Neil's heart pounded as he considered approaching them, but he quickly dismissed the idea. This wasn't the time or place to try to make amends. The panel discussion began shortly after, with Danielle as one of the featured speakers. She spoke passionately about her experience at Prestige Emporium, framing it not as a moment of anger, but as an opportunity for growth. We all carry biases, she said, her voice steady. The question isn't whether we have them, it's whether we're willing to confront them and change. Change isn't easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. But it starts with a willingness to listen, to learn, and to act. Trevor chimed in, sharing his perspective as a black man navigating professional spaces. We're not here to shame anyone, he said. We're here to challenge the systems and behaviors that perpetuate exclusion. And that challenge starts with accountability. Neil listened intently, their words resonating deeply. For the first time, he saw Danielle and Trevor not as symbols of his failure, but as people who had turned their pain into purpose. As the discussion concluded, attendees were invited to ask questions. Neil hesitated, but a voice in the back of his mind urged him forward. When it was his turn, he stood, his palms sweating. Hi, my name is Neil Carter, he began, his voice shaky. I'm the security guard from Prestige Emporium. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward him. Danielle and Trevor exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. I came here tonight because I wanted to listen, Neil continued, his voice growing steadier. I've spent the past few weeks reflecting on what I did, and I realize now how wrong I was. I judged you without reason, and I let my assumptions dictate my actions. For that, I'm deeply sorry. He took a deep breath, willing himself to continue. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I'm here because I want to do better. I want to understand how I can be part of the solution instead of the problem. Danielle's gaze softened, and she leaned forward slightly. Thank you, Neil, she said after a moment. Acknowledging your mistakes is an important first step. But as you said, the real work is in what comes next. Are you ready for that? Neil nodded. I am. After the event, Neil approached Danielle and Trevor privately. To his surprise, they welcomed the conversation, albeit cautiously. They listened as he shared his journey over the past few weeks, and while they didn't absolve him of his actions, they appreciated his willingness to learn. This isn't an easy road, Neil, Danielle said. But if you're serious about change, it's worth it. Trevor added, accountability doesn't end with an apology. It's what you do after that matters. Neil left the event feeling a strange mix of emotions, relief, gratitude, and a renewed sense of purpose. He decided to volunteer with local organizations focused on diversity and inclusion, using his experience as a cautionary tale to help others recognize and address their own biases. Meanwhile, at Prestige Emporium, the changes implemented by Caroline Hastings continued to take root. The company's commitment to inclusivity began to show tangible results, from improved employee morale to increased customer satisfaction. The incident with Danielle and Trevor had become a turning point, not just for the store, but for the brand as a whole. Danielle and Trevor remained involved, serving as advisors to the company's newly formed Inclusivity Council. Their influence extended beyond the store, inspiring other businesses to examine their own practices and biases. In the months that followed, Neil found himself transformed. While his career at Prestige Emporium was over, he had found a new calling in advocating for equity and understanding. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, Neil felt he was on the right path. The legacy of change. Months later, Prestige Emporium hosted a grand relaunch event at its Madison Square location, now touted as a flagship for inclusivity and innovation in retail. The event was a culmination of months of effort, highlighting the changes made not just to the store's aesthetic, but to its core values. The company's leadership, including Caroline Hastings, saw it as an opportunity to show the world that they were serious about transforming their culture. The evening was marked by a red carpet leading into the store, where the shimmering chandeliers and modern art installations served as a backdrop to the celebration. Invited guests included members of the press, community leaders, and loyal customers. Among them were Danielle and Trevor Johnson, whose presence was symbolic of the store's commitment to accountability and growth. Danielle, dressed in a striking emerald gown, stood beside Trevor, who looked equally dashing in a classic black tuxedo. They had been hesitant about attending, unsure whether the changes at Prestige Emporium were genuine or performative. But as they entered the store, the energy in the room felt different, welcoming, diverse, and inclusive. Caroline greeted them warmly. "Danielle, Trevor, thank you for coming," she said, her tone sincere. "This night wouldn't be possible without your voices and your courage." Danielle smiled faintly. "We're here to see if the changes you've made are real, Caroline." Caroline nodded, unfazed by the challenge. "I think you'll find they are." As the evening unfolded, guests were guided through displays showcasing the store's transformation. Signs now prominently featured diverse models of varying ages, ethnicities, and body types. Employees wore new badges that included their pronouns and the languages they spoke, a subtle but meaningful gesture to create a welcoming environment. Interactive kiosks highlighted the store's new initiatives, including its Inclusivity Council, anonymous reporting system, and partnership with local community organizations. Danielle and Trevor were impressed by the breadth of the changes, but remained cautiously optimistic. They listened closely as Caroline introduced the evening's keynote speaker, a young retail associate who shared her personal journey of feeling marginalized in the workplace and how the new policies had empowered her to thrive. Meanwhile, Neil Carter stood at the edge of the crowd, observing from a distance. He hadn't been invited to the event, but had decided to attend anonymously, blending into the background. He wanted to see for himself how much of the transformation was genuine. Neil had spent the past months volunteering with diversity-focused nonprofits, attending workshops, and rebuilding his understanding of fairness and inclusion. His journey was far from over, but he felt compelled to witness the outcome of the incident that had changed his life. As the speeches concluded, Neil watched as Danielle and Trevor moved through the crowd, graciously accepting the thanks of those who recognized them as catalysts for the change. Neil's chest tightened. He had come to respect the couple deeply, not just for their success, but for their unyielding commitment to justice and progress. Taking a deep breath, Neil stepped forward, weaving through the crowd until he was just a few feet away from Danielle and Trevor. He hesitated, unsure if approaching them again was the right thing to do. But Trevor noticed him first, his expression unreadable. "Neil," Trevor said, his tone neutral but not unfriendly. "What brings you here?" Danielle turned, her eyes narrowing slightly as she recognized him. Neil straightened, his hands trembling slightly. I didn't mean to intrude," he said quickly. "I wasn't invited, but I wanted to see what came of everything. I wanted to see if the changes were real." Danielle studied him for a long moment before speaking. "And what do you think?" Neil swallowed hard. "I think they are," he said honestly. "And I think it's because of you." Danielle's expression softened slightly, though her posture remained poised. "We didn't do this alone," she said. It took people willing to listen and act. Neil nodded. I'm trying to be one of those people. I've made mistakes, big ones, but I'm working to be better. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that you've inspired me to change. Trevor regarded Neil thoughtfully before extending a hand. Neil hesitated, then shook it, a sense of relief washing over him. It's not about perfection, Trevor said. It's about progress. As the night wound down, Caroline approached Danielle and Trevor once more. Before you leave, there's one more thing I'd like to share, she said, leading them to a private room off the main floor. Inside, a large plaque hung on the wall, engraved with the words, "In honor of those who challenged us to be better. May we continue to grow, listen, and change." Below the inscription was a smaller plaque with Danielle and Trevor's names, along with a dedication to fostering inclusivity in all spaces. Danielle's breath caught, and for the first time that evening, her composure faltered. This means a lot," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Trevor placed a hand on her back, nodding in agreement. "Thank you, Caroline. This is a step in the right direction." Caroline smiled. "Thank you for holding us accountable and for believing in the possibility of change." The event ended, but its impact lingered. Danielle and Trevor left the store that night feeling a cautious sense of closure. They knew the fight for justice and equality was far from over, but they also knew that their voices had made a difference. As Neil walked home, he reflected on the night's events. He realized that transformation wasn't about grand gestures. It was about the small, consistent steps people took to challenge themselves and their worldviews. For the first time in months, Neil felt a glimmer of hope. The legacy of the incident at Prestige Emporium continued to ripple outward. The store became a model for inclusivity in retail, inspiring other companies to follow suit. Danielle and Trevor's advocacy led to speaking engagements and consulting opportunities, solidifying their role as changemakers. Neil, too, found his own way forward, dedicating his life to education and equity work. In the end, the story of Prestige Emporium wasn't just about a single incident. It was about the power of accountability, the courage to confront uncomfortable truths, and the belief that even in our darkest moments, change is possible. The legacy of change. As Danielle and Trevor left the private room with Caroline, the weight of the evening's events settled over them. The engraved plaque dedicated to their efforts was a powerful acknowledgement of their role in sparking change. Yet Danielle couldn't help but reflect on how far society still had to go. "Do you think it's enough?" Trevor asked as they walked through the now quieting store, their footsteps echoing against the polished floors. Danielle turned to him, her gaze thoughtful. "It's a start," she said softly. "But real change doesn't happen overnight. What matters is that they're committed to staying on this path." Trevor nodded. "And so are we." Neil's journey continues. Neil left the event feeling a mix of emotions: relief that the changes were real, gratitude for the conversation he'd had with Danielle and Trevor, but also a sense of unfinished business. He had seen firsthand the damage his actions could cause, and while he was working to rebuild himself, he knew he owed it to others to ensure they never went through what Danielle and Trevor had. The next morning, Neil reached out to one of the organizations he had been volunteering with, Voices for Change, a nonprofit dedicated to educating communities about implicit bias and systemic inequities. He pitched an idea for a workshop specifically for retail and customer service professionals, designed to address the biases that often went unchecked in those industries. To his surprise, the organization embraced the idea, and within weeks, Neil found himself co-leading workshops alongside experienced facilitators. Drawing from his own experience, he shared his story not as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to the importance of self-awareness and growth. At first, Neil struggled with the vulnerability required to share his mistakes so openly. But as he saw the impact his words had on attendees, many of whom were hearing about these issues for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced before. Danielle and Trevor's expanding impact. Meanwhile, Danielle and Trevor's lives grew increasingly busy as their advocacy efforts expanded. Danielle, already an accomplished marketing executive, was invited to join the boards of two major organizations focused on diversity and equity in the workplace. Trevor began mentoring young professionals of color, helping them navigate industries where they were often underrepresented. One day, Danielle received a message from Caroline Hastings requesting her input on a new initiative Prestige Emporium was launching, a scholarship program for underprivileged students interested in business and fashion. The program, funded in part by profits from the store's newly popularized inclusive brand, aimed to create opportunities for those who might otherwise be excluded from the industry. Danielle and Trevor met with Caroline over lunch to discuss the program. As they reviewed the details, Danielle was struck by how much Caroline had grown since their first meeting. What had initially seemed like damage control now felt like genuine dedication to creating a lasting legacy. "This is impressive, Caroline," Danielle said, closing the folder. "But I think you can go even further." Caroline raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "Partner with grassroots organizations," Danielle suggested. "Support local initiatives that are already doing this work. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. You need to amplify the voices already in the space." Caroline nodded thoughtfully. "You're right. We'll do that." Trevor added, "And make sure the program doesn't just focus on getting students into the industry. Focus on keeping them there. Mentorship, networking opportunities, and support systems are just as important as the scholarship itself." Caroline smiled. "Consider it done." An unexpected meeting. Several months later, Neil was invited to speak at a regional conference for retail professionals. Nervous but determined, he prepared meticulously, weaving together his personal story with actionable steps for addressing bias in the workplace. As he stepped onto the stage, he was surprised to see Danielle and Trevor in the audience. After his presentation, the couple approached him, their expressions warm. "You've come a long way, Neil," Danielle said, extending her hand. "That was powerful." Trevor nodded in agreement. "You're using your experience to make a difference. That's what matters." Neil smiled, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "Thank you. That means more than you know." The three of them stood together, a moment of shared understanding passing between them. They were unlikely allies, brought together by an incident that could have driven them apart. Instead, it had sparked a chain of events that changed not just their lives, but the lives of countless others. The ripple effect. By the end of the year, Prestige Emporium was being recognized as a leader in diversity and inclusion within the retail industry. The company's transformation inspired other businesses to re-examine their practices, leading to a wave of similar initiatives across the sector. Danielle and Trevor's efforts extended beyond Prestige Emporium, influencing policies and practices in industries ranging from finance to education. Their story became a case study in how accountability and advocacy could drive meaningful change. Neil, too, found his place in this new movement. His workshops became a staple in the industry, and he began collaborating with Danielle and Trevor on broader initiatives, bringing their shared vision for a more equitable world to life. A new chapter. On the one-year anniversary of the incident, Danielle and Trevor returned to the Madison Square store for a quiet visit. The changes were evident, not just in the decor or the signage, but in the energy of the space. Customers of all backgrounds moved comfortably through the aisles, greeted warmly by staff who seemed genuinely invested in their experience. As they stood in the center of the store, Danielle turned to Trevor. "We've come a long way," she said. Trevor smiled. "And we're not done yet." Danielle nodded. "No, we're not. But this is a good start." Hand in hand, they left the store, ready to tackle whatever came next. Behind them, the plaque bearing their names glinted under the store's soft lights, a reminder of the power of courage, accountability, and the belief that change, no matter how difficult, is always possible.